Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you in worship today. For those who are guests with us, I'm Pastor John. And I'd like to start today by recapping a little bit about what we talked about last week. We looked at this wonderful passage from Ephesians chapter 2, which says that we are God's masterpiece created in Jesus Christ. And it was this wonderful story of what Jesus has done for us in taking us from death and eternal doom, and by his grace, through his sacrifice on the cross and his resurrection from the dead, that he gives us a new life, a new heart, and a new eternal destiny as we trust in him by faith. It is by Jesus that we are saved. But last week, we spent a lot of time saying it's not just that we're saved by Jesus, we are saved for a purpose. Now, if you were with us last week, you were saved to what? Do you remember? You were saved to serve. Saved to serve. And that is your destiny that God has put in place for you even before the start of the world. He saved you so that you might serve him and his purposes. Now, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be continuing on this theme of service because it is so central to the Christian life, and it really is the distinguishing mark of a follower of Jesus, a heart of service. Now, Jesus emphasized this very critical point of service at a very special moment with his disciples. It really highlights the importance of it. Now, the setting was the Last Supper, and Jesus was soon to face the cross the next morning. And as they were having their last meal together, the Passover supper, Jesus got up in the middle of the meal, and he took off his outer robe. He took a towel and he wrapped it around his waist, and then he filled up a basin with water. And then, getting down on his knees, he proceeded to go around and to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them down with the towel that was wrapped around his waist. When Jesus did this, it was quite unexpected, and to be honest, unwelcomed. Even Peter, flat out said, no, you'll never do this to me. Why was this unwelcomed? Well, because it was a very humiliating job. It was the lowest of the low. It was. You think of the feet and the people in the first century. They were dirty. They were sweaty. They were gross. There was no other way to describe it. They were probably pretty gross. And to see Jesus get down on his hands and knees and to wash people's feet, well, honestly, for the disciples, it was just too much. Because he was this very powerful leader, and he was their rabbi, their teacher. And if it was anything, it should have been like the other way, like them washing his feet. And yet Jesus persists until he goes around the table and he washes all of their feet. Feet that would soon, in a matter of hours, run to betray him, to deny him, and desert him. Well, John 13 tells us the story of this foot washing. And verses 12 through 17 tell us what I think is even more important. It's the aftermath of this foot washing, where Jesus kind of debriefs the disciples on what has just happened in this surprising event. So we're going to read this together, and it'll be on your screen. When he, Jesus, had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. We're going to take some time today and really study this wonderful, wonderful passage of Jesus' words. Now notice right after Jesus has washed their feet, he asks them a question about it. And he asks, do you understand what I have done to you? Do you understand what has just happened? Because it was a very significant moment at a very, very critical time in Jesus' life. And he did not want this moment to pass without them, the disciples, understanding the importance of the moment. But Jesus doesn't just leave it as up to the disciples to come up with their own conclusions. In the verses we just read, Jesus highlights, I believe, four very critical lessons that he wants the disciples to understand about what he had just done. And he wants us to understand these same four lessons today. So lesson one, Jesus wanted to set an example for them. He says in verse 15, I have given you an example. Well, when Jesus says, do you understand what I've done to you? He's obviously talking about more than just the physical act of washing their feet. Because he says, do you understand what I've done? I mean, they'd be like, yeah, you just washed our feet. Like that's an absurd question. It makes no sense. When Jesus asks, do you understand what I've done? He's saying there's something more. There is something more significant that he wants them to understand. And it's about being a servant. About being a servant. And Jesus wanted his followers to be servants. Okay? Jesus wanted his followers to be servants. And so Jesus did what all good leaders do. He didn't just tell them what to do. He showed them. He modeled it for them. And he did it by performing the most humble and humiliating and lowest task there was. Now, that's just a singular event. And when Jesus says, he set an example, I think he's talking about more than the foot washing. I mean, his entire life was one great act of service. I mean, just think of him leaving heaven, coming to earth, taking the form of a human, living this humble life as a poor carpenter. Everything he does is this act of service. And Jesus says this himself in Matthew chapter 20. He says, I did not come to be served, but to serve, to give my life as a ransom for many. I came to serve. Now, as we read through the four Gospels that talk about Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see all kinds of examples of Jesus serving people. Jesus sees a world full of need, and he has compassion on the world. He loves the world, and we see him so often healing people and just, all through the day and all through the night and feeding people. There's an account where Jesus, he is so exhausted from serving that he sleeps on a boat that's about to sink during this fierce storm on the Sea of Galilee. That's how tired he was physically in his body from serving. He gave himself away constantly. Now, of course, the ultimate example of Jesus serving is his death on the cross that gives us salvation. Jesus died on the cross to take away our sin, and Jesus was willing to surrender everything, to give everything away, even his very life, for our sake. So Jesus truly came to serve and to set an example with the foot washing, but with kind of everything he did. It was an example. And so what Jesus says to the disciples around the table at the Last Supper and to us, to you today, he's saying, this is the pattern for you to follow. This is the pattern for you to follow. And if you call me Savior, then your lives are supposed to look like mine. They're supposed to be patterned after mine. So if we think about like a pattern, you can think of like a pattern for sewing. And if, let's say it was a pattern for a shirt. And if you and I had the same pattern and we passed that pattern around and to 10 different people and we all made that shirt, all our shirts should look totally the same, right? Because we used the same pattern. It wasn't you did what you wanted and I did what I did. We all followed the same pattern and they should all look similar. And Jesus is saying that about life, that our life is to be patterned after him. And specifically here, he says, your life should be patterned after the way I give myself to service. And truly, we are never more like Jesus in this lifetime than when we are serving others. We are never more like Jesus than when we are serving others. And every time we are serving, we are becoming more and more like him. We're following his example, and our lives start to look like the pattern he has set before us, because our hands start doing the things he did. Our feet start going to the places he went. Our heart starts beating for the people the way his did. Our voices start to speak his words of hope and truth into people's life. And now, so the challenge for us and for those disciples was to actually follow the pattern. To follow the pattern. There was a Christian pastor and theologian who lived a little over 100 years ago, Alexander Maclaren, and he sums it up so well. Like the human condition, it hasn't changed. This challenge to pattern our lives after Jesus is nothing new. And so Maclaren writes this: there are too many of us who profess to be quite willing to trust in Jesus Christ as the cleanser of our souls, who are not nearly so willing to accept his example as the pattern for our lives. Again, I think the challenge for us is, instead of patterning our life after Jesus, we want to make alterations to the pattern. We don't want to do it the way he did, or we want to do just completely our own thing, something new, something different. But what Jesus is telling us here so directly is he is the pattern. He is the example. And so he says, do you understand what I've done? I am the pattern. But he also wants his disciples, and he wants us to know that serving others is not an option. That's really the second lesson, that doing this, patterning our lives after him, it is not an option. Because Jesus says that you ought to do this. You should do this as I have done to you. You also ought to wash one another's feet. So the command there, you ought to do this, means that there's a command. He's telling us to do this. And really the word ought there, it implies like an indebtedness, that it's not an option if we want to serve, that we are required to do it as part of coming to Christ, that serving is our responsibility, it's our duty. We are kind of morally, legally obligated to do this. And it is an act of gratitude for the infinite debt that we owe to Jesus Christ. So the language there, again, that the disciples would have known, was Jesus is saying, you need to do this. This is required of you. This is not an option. Now, I was thinking about this, and I think one of the ways that we really need to talk about this is even in the language we use. Often, certainly around church, we will use the language of being a volunteer. And a volunteer, by definition, is someone who does something out of the goodness of their heart. There's no mandate, there's no requirement. They just do it to be a nice person or to do a nice thing. And I have a neighbor who has volunteered for the Harbor Humane Society, and she does it not because she has to, but because she has a heart for that and she wants to help the homeless pets and just do a nice thing. But she's not paid for that or compensated in any way. And she's not obligated to do it. She can quit anytime she wants. Now, again, often in church, we'll talk about how we need volunteers for this ministry or that. And, we want to say, who's going to volunteer to do X, Y, or Z? But I want to be helpful here with our language that within the church, there are no volunteers. Okay? Churches don't have volunteers. And I think we, me included, we need to stop using this word, this V word around the church, because when we start talking about volunteers, we imply that there is a choice. You don't have to, you can if you want, but there is no obligation to do so. And you can do it if you feel like you're up to it, or if you want to go above and beyond or something like that. And if you notice, the title of the sermon on the outline was The Church with No Volunteers. And when you first hear that, you might be like, boy, that sounds terrible. That sounds like a church where nothing gets done. But actually, I think it's the flip side. I think it would be wonderful where no one in the church ever thought of themselves as a volunteer, but they had a right understanding that they were a servant, an indebted servant to Jesus Christ, and that all that their acts of service are, it's purposeful and joyful. And honestly, I think we'd have more people joining in on ministry if we didn't just think of ourselves as volunteers. And so the question is this. And I think over time, we've all had this question in our mind. An opportunity to serve comes up, and we say, should I volunteer for this? Should I volunteer? And really, that question misses the point. It's based on a completely false premise that you and I are volunteers. I think the better question for us to ask is, am I a faithful or unfaithful servant? And that doesn't mean we sign up to do everything, because we can't do that, and that's not healthy for us to do that. But the question is, am I a faithful servant or am I unfaithful? So Jesus, he gives us a pattern, and then he tells us and the disciples, it's not an option. You have to do this. You need to do this. Well, the third lesson he wanted the disciples to take away when he says, do you understand what I've done, was that he wanted them to remember their place. He says, remember your place. Jesus says to them, remember that the servant is not greater than the master. That there's a pecking order, there's a hierarchy, that the master is here and then the servant is here. And Jesus is the master and the disciples are down here as his servants. In other words, you're never going to be above Jesus. You're never going to be equal with me. That's what he's telling the disciples. And certainly the same is true again for us. Now, here's the thing. If Jesus is our master here and we are his servants down here, and if Jesus would humbly serve in this way of foot washing, how much more appropriate is it that we who are underneath him and less than him would also be servants? I remember a time when I was in the Army, and for those who have been in the military, you will know what this means. When there was a police call, it didn't mean a crime had been committed. It meant everybody had to go out, and you'd kind of walk shoulder to shoulder, a few feet apart, and you would pick up all the trash on the ground, whether it was around a building or a range you were at, but police call. And I never liked to do the police call around the building because there were about 5 million cigarette butts. And I hated picking them up, and it was gross, and I didn't smoke, and I didn't want to have to be out there. And they would call for police call, and everybody was supposed to go out. But I started to notice that there were some other people, some of the higher officers didn't go out. And being an officer, I was just like, I don't want to do this. I didn't contribute to this. I don't want to, I don't want to go out there. And for a few times I didn't until one day, looking out the window, I saw our battalion commander out there doing police call and getting down on his, hands and knees and picking up cigarette butts and little pieces of wrappers and trash. And I just remember thinking like, wow, like if this colonel is out there doing this, then like I have absolutely no reason to be in here, because he's up here, I'm down here. And Jesus is, I think, just when we see Jesus washing feet, it's like the same thing. We see him doing like the lowest of the low, and that automatically takes away any excuse we would have about not serving. And I think that's the thing, like when we're not willing to serve, all of a sudden we've become like bigger than the Lord. We've become higher than Jesus, right? And when we do that, like we're in big trouble, right? I mean, we're just in big trouble with where we're at spiritually. But also, if I don't have this servant attitude, and again, I'm just not remembering my place, then I'm never going to be representing the Lord, right? If I'm supposed to be patterning and being under him, and as I do that, then the world gets to see like, oh, this is what Jesus is like. These are the kinds of things he does. And so when Jesus is washing the disciples' feet, and again, he takes this very menial, dirty, humiliating task, it's this visual reminder to the disciples to don't set yourself up on a pedestal. Don't set yourself up where you're waiting for people to serve you. You need to get out and serve others first. So the question I would have for you as we're studying this is for you to just reflect on this. What is your more natural position? Is it to serve or to wait for people to serve you? And think of it at home, with your family, or at work, or at church, or whatever it is. Are you waiting for people to serve you and get you what you want and take care of you? Or are you more in a position of a servant? Okay, so finally, let's get to our fourth lesson that Jesus really wants to communicate. So when Jesus says, "Do you understand what I've done to you?" he wants to make certain that his disciples don't lose sight of the blessing that comes in serving. So the disciples, as we read through the Gospels up till now, they're constantly fighting and bickering. They're jockeying for position, for authority, because they are thinking like blessing comes from being first in line, the top of the heap sort of a thing. And so this one final lesson that Jesus teaches them with the foot washing is that the pathway to true joy and happiness goes in a much different direction than me first. And Jesus says in verse 17, his closing words are, "For I've given you example that you should also do just as I do to you." That was verse 15. And then verse 17, "If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." You are blessed if you do it. You are blessed. Now, certainly, there are going to be people who will be on the other side of your obedience and faithfulness. And because you are serving, they will be blessed by it. But Jesus says the primary object of the blessing is us, is those who take the place of a servant, which is not how we think of it. And Jesus says, so you'll be blessed if you do it, if you actually get out there and do it. Not you'll be blessed if you know about it. He doesn't say you'll be blessed if you hear a sermon about it and you take good notes. He doesn't say you'll be blessed if you meet with your small group and you talk about it. Or you'll not be blessed if you intend to do it, but you'll be blessed if you do it. You will be blessed if you do it. So we come to this point where Jesus is either telling us the truth that we will be happy if we follow his example, or he's lying. He's either telling the truth or he's lying or he's wrong. So let me ask you, what does your experience tell you? Does Jesus tell the truth? Has Jesus misled you or misguided you? Have his words of instruction ever been harmful to you? Haven't for me. Jesus is truth. He speaks truth. He can only speak truth. And then we think about our own experiences in life. What gives us more joy? Getting a great gift or giving a great gift? Are we more satisfied when somebody serves us beautifully or when we have an opportunity to serve someone else beautifully? You are blessed if you do it. You actually do it. There's a group in our church, not many of us, but we go to Muskegon Heights every month and serve to some people who are in some pretty down and out circumstances. We serve them dinner. And we put it on plates, we take it to them, we serve, try to get to know them a little and encourage them. And it's not in a good neighborhood, and we don't certainly get anything out of it. But I'll tell you what, nobody leaves that experience who's volunteering, who's serving. They're not volunteering. No one leaves sad. They don't leave angry. Nobody leaves with a frown on their face or disappointed. We always leave happy, joyful, feeling like we did what we were supposed to, and we're grateful that we had an opportunity to serve, and that, as is often the case, we are more blessed by being there than the people who receive the food. As Jesus says, you are blessed if you do it. So, in conclusion, Jesus has established this pattern of service with foot washing in his whole life that really is supposed to impact every area of us, and certainly starting in your home. But it's supposed to be everywhere, and that includes our church as well, our church family. Now, we have numerous opportunities that people can serve here at our church or even digitally. And we have these booklets, and we'll make these available to you. And they're all different ways that you can serve here, that you can follow the pattern of Jesus right here at First Reformed Church. And as I look through this, there's a bunch of different ways, but these aren't just holes to fill. These are invitations to blessing, invitations to be conformed more and more to the image of Jesus. So as you have an opportunity to look through this, I want you to read through it and ask yourself, do I understand what Jesus has done to me?